Fairly recently, I got to play Ni No Kuni Wrath of the White Witch, which was an experience that I look very mixed back on. It had its fair share of issues, but its great atmosphere and art style, provided by Studio Ghibli, and its very interesting and fascinating combat system did garner that game a special place in my heart. It also left me with a wish for more, and thankfully, that is where Ni No Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom comes in. Going into Ni No Kuni 2, I did know from the start that the most interesting and my personal favorite one from the prequel got completely changed. And it was unfortunate to learn that Studio Ghibli was not involved with this game either. Which of course is a shame, because I wanted to see the elements that I really liked but required more work to be developed further. Yet, it's also kind of interesting. Not only am I curious to see what Level 5 does with Ni No Kuni's art style on their own, but this game is not based and designed as a remake/port of a DS game, therefore giving room to new and other possibilities that might bring change for better or for worse. Let's find out in this review which one of the two it is. In Ni No Kuni 2 Revenant Kingdom, we follow a young boy named Evan Paddlewisker Tildrum, who lost his father and throne by the betrayal of one of his closest advisors. After narrowly escaping death, he sets off to create a new kingdom from where he wants to reclaim his old one and unite the other kingdoms of the world under one banner of peace. However, building a kingdom, let alone unite the entire world, is no easy feat and comes with many challenges that this young king and his friends have to face before they can achieve it. Just like in the first game, the second game has a very simple and direct story. The path that our hero is going to walk is laid out quickly and is focused on solely. And while a story resolving around betrayal, a dethroned king, building a new kingdom, and politics around world peace can be a very detailed and complex story, it's far from it here, as it's written in a more like fairy tale style of way, where these complex situations and challenges are simplified to the point that they become achievable for a young boy. Personally, I find such stories always to be very tricky, as it requires you to go with the flow to enjoy them, and where applying logic and realism actually damages your experience. Thankfully, the flow and pacing of Ni No Kuni 2's story is simple, fast, and easy to go along with. The entire game stays dead center on the story, and unlike the first game, does not distract from it a single time. Another way it makes up for its lack of detail and complexity is the tone the story is presented in. Again, the best way to describe the tone of the story is fairy tale. It's very hopeful, light-hearted, and even with a bit of humor. And while I do prefer these elements presented here in a more detailed and complex story, I was not really missing the details here, as I was able to enjoy this story quite a lot thanks to its accessible, easy to go along with flow and pacing. There were two things that I was missing though, that being growth of the characters and the chemistry amongst each other. Evan is treated the best when it comes to character growth, as well, he's the main character. What do you expect? He is in the spotlight. But all the other characters felt more like stepping stones and didn't develop or change much over the course of the story. The best chemistry between characters we got in the game was between Evan and Roland, yet that was only for a little bit and absent for most others. From the story point of view and especially its pacing, I understand why they didn't spend much time on growth or the chemistry amongst characters, but that didn't change my feeling that I was missing it a little bit. Still, across the board, this story was a lot better compared to the story in the previous game. Despite the fact that they share many similarities like the tone and the hero/fairy tale story perspective, the story here in Ni No Kuni 2 felt more like a completed and connected story experience. Especially because the pacing and the focus on the story worked together so well and really made it easy to go along smoothly with its flow. Now if that's because Studio Ghibli was not involved here, I can't say for certain. But what I can say for certain is that I miss Studio Ghibli's involvement when it comes to the game's art style, world design and atmosphere. The involvement of Studio Ghibli in the art style, world design and atmosphere of the first game was very noticeable. And I did love those elements a lot, as Studio Ghibli has a very detailed, unique and characteristic style. Their absence in this game was heavily felt, as level 5 did not manage to recreate that Studio Ghibli vibe. Now, that is not to say that the art style used here in Ni No Kuni 2 is bad. In fact, I enjoyed its colorful, simplistic design and atmosphere a lot. And I would even argue that the noticeable difference in art style did the story and world building a big favor. Ni No Kuni 2 is a continuation of the first game, but if I solely look at the art style, atmosphere and world building and such, I wouldn't say that. A lot of things have changed in this world. Like the fairies are not present here anymore. Magic and other introduced rules work a lot different, and old locations are almost all gone. And even the map is geographically a completely new thing. On top of that, the main story does not really reference the events of the previous game either. And while you can find references of the previous game in the world, it felt very loose and disconnected. To me, Ni No Kuni 2 felt more like how Final Fantasy or the Tales of series make new entries to their series, using the same build blocks in different ways to create similar yet new stories, characters and worlds. And honestly, I wouldn't mind if Ni No Kuni would commit to this idea in the future. Not only does it offer a lot of possibilities for the future of the series, but it also can help out in things like here with the art style. In the end, when it comes to the art style and atmosphere, it's an unfortunate downgrade from the first game. It's unfortunate as the problem is not that what we got is bad. It's just that the art style of Studio Ghibli and the atmosphere they managed to create is so unique that it's almost impossible to recreate by others. Another aspect that is here drastically changed compared to the first game is the combat. In Ni No Kuni 1, a combination of JRPG and Pokémon was made, and that combination was a very interesting one. It was also a bit rough, and it was clearly held back by certain design choices. But the idea was there, and there was a decent foundation created with it. Therefore, I would have loved to see Ni No Kuni 2 continuing building on top of this combat system. Yet, in the end, they decided to take a completely different route. And that route is not that bad. In fact, it's good and quite solid even. Ni No Kuni 2 let go of the monster taming aspect and went all in on the JRPG aspects, resulting in a combat system that reminded me a lot of the combat systems found in the Tales of series or many other JRPGs. The combat feels very fast, and despite the JRPG elements, a lot like hack and slash. Combat encounters are fought in a free-headed party, yet has a very individual feeling to it, as there's no direct way you can control or instruct the other party members to take on certain roles or do specific actions, which was something that played a big role in the first game. However, the lack of control over the party is made up here by them just being very reliable and competent in combat, something that was a problem in the first game. The most control you have outside of your own actions is over these minions, Higgledies. They spawn at the start of the battle and fight alongside you, and after a while they group up and wait for you to command them to do a special attack, which does not only massive damage, but it's a fun distraction from the usual combat, as you have to keep a good overview of the battle and see what they are doing. And then there's this fun little side distraction, which is, it's combat, but it's not part of the overall combat. These skirmishes, as they are called, are small mini-game style events that you can find on the map where you fight with little armies against other little armies. It's not really a solid minigame, as it's a little bit mindless and you just throw in all the units you have, but a fun distraction nonetheless. But back to the combat itself. Just like other JRPGs, you have multiple systems in the background that play a huge role. Think of things like gear, skills, elemental strength and weaknesses and so on. It's pretty standard stuff for JRPGs, yet Ni No Kuni does manage to distinguish itself from the standard JRPGs in two ways. The first one being the Tactic Tweaker. It's a system that gives you the power to influence your party effectiveness and stats like a DJ, as the system is compiled of these little switches and sliders that you constantly have to tweak between battles. The higher your level becomes, the more points you can invest, and therefore the more you can tweak. And to use this system optimally, it's required of you to know thy enemy. Let's say you are in an area where mostly slime enemies roam around. Then you might want to drop resistance against fire and invest more in dealing damage to slime enemies. Is a boss constantly affecting you with a certain debuff or side effect, then you might want to tweak your resistance against it here in the Tech Tweaker DJ table. The Tech Tweaker is a very little but effective and fun thing to play around with. And what surprised me the most is that it stayed very relevant throughout the whole game. Even after investing all of your points, it never maxes out like a skill tree. You still have to make choices like I just described in the endgame, keeping you invested with your enemies and tactics, even if it's just for a little. If there's one thing I didn't like about the Tactic Tweaker, it is its accessibility, as that is just annoying. Tweaking something should be done fast and on the fly, yet here you gotta open some menus to just get to it. And if you are in a difficult area, you gotta tweak things every single time between combat encounters, which again can be kinda annoying over the long run. It would have been nice to be able to do this actively in-game than outside it in some menu. But still, despite that little shortcoming, I love this system and I was honestly surprised by it. Now, the other way Ni No Kuni 2's combat system, or more its overall progression, manages to distinguish itself from other JRPGs is via the kingdom management. In this story, we play as a young king trying to build a new kingdom completely from scratch. And we get to do exactly that, which is really cool. After the first chapter, we get access to our new kingdom and it's up to us to develop it. We get to do this by building, researching, recruiting and employing people from all over the world. Now, creatively, we have no input how the kingdom is going to look. Mainly because the kingdom serves as a nice cover-up for what otherwise would be standard progression or even just a plain skill tree. To get stronger equipment or better consumables or even skills, you have to invest in the right buildings. Complete certain side quests to recruit the right people and then spend them sweet tax money to do research. Again, it's pretty basic progression, yet it's in a clever way presented, as it's very tangible throughout your whole playthrough. Each side quest you do, each item you pick up and every investment you make is reflected in your kingdom, making what is supposed to be just side/busy work feel like important tasks for a king, as you want to see your kingdom grow and develop. And it's this kind of thing that I am a big sucker for. I mean, I really like these kind of systems. Though, if you're not into this kind of progression like I am, and you just want a plain skill tree, then you will get into a slight problem here in Ni No Kuni 2. Halfway through the game, an insane level curve suddenly appears. Even I, who did a large amount of side quests and grind, was getting out-leveled at some point. Which is annoying, because it means you have to grind even more, though I kinda didn't mind that, but it did pull the brakes on the story and such. Thankfully, the game offers ways to actively step out of the main story to do side quests or grind without setting you far back or forcing a lot of backtracking on you, which is highly appreciated. But being forced down this side path, especially after I invested so much into it already, is never really fun at its core. So be warned that if you don't pace the main story and the side quests properly yourself, it could cause some issues after the halfway point. What is less noticeable, but probably is the best part of these systems and the overall combat, is the accessibility it offers. Ni No Kuni 2 avoids the issues many other JRPGs have, because games in the genre have the tendency to throw loads of systems at you, and some, or even all, can get very complicated or convoluted, to the point that many people don't want to play them, which I can understand. But that does not happen here in Ni No Kuni 2, far from it even. It's a very accessible JRPG. Because just like with the story, the combat system stays very clear, direct and simple, and therefore a lot of fun. As it was very clear from the start, Ni No Kuni 2 is a lot different than the first game. And during my time with the game, I did miss certain things, like the Studio Ghibli art style and atmosphere, or the rough but interesting combat system. Yet when I compare what I got in return, I would say I prefer Ni No Kuni 2 over the first game. Because the overall experience of Ni No Kuni 2 is just a lot more fun. And while I love interesting elements and want to see those being done more justice, my patience with that has its limits. And let's be honest, sometimes it's nice to just have some fun. The story here is written much better, and while, just like the first game, depends heavily on you going with the flow, it does a much better job making sure you get and stay in that flow. By focusing heavily on the story and not striving away from it with loads of unnecessary backtracking or disconnected side plots. On top of that, as far as JRPGs goes, this one is very simplistic and accessible. And it avoids issues that for some are deal breakers when it comes to the genre. And yes, that does mean the combat system is a lot less interesting, but it is more solid, more polished, and thereby just a lot of fun to indulge in. I've seen some comments and concerns on the big changes to Ni No Kuni 2, especially about the absence of Studio Ghibli, which I understand and to a certain level agree with. But I would strongly argue that Ni No Kuni 2 should be considered a game on its own. Despite the fact that Level 5 sells this game off as a continuation of the complete series. To me, again, it felt more like Final Fantasy or the Tales of series, as Ni No Kuni seemed to be built by similar build blocks from the first game instead of being directly connected to it by characters, events, and lore. And there's so little connection to the previous installment that you can easily play this game without even having touched the first game. And that is how I will recommend this game. Despite it carrying the name of the series, the experience it offers is a lot different than the other game in the series. So if you are interested in Ni No Kuni 2 after hearing what I told about it, I definitely recommend you checking it out. No matter if you played the first game or not, as it can stand completely on its own. And if you have played the first game, I actually highly recommend to play this one as well, but to approach it as a completely separate new entity and have an open mind towards the new and changed things.